Welcome back, everyone, as we dive back into the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine. This is episode 4 from Extra History. If you did not see my reaction to the first 3 episodes, there's a link in the description that will take you back to the beginning. We will be covering more of the historic events that are unfolding surrounding the passing of Queen Elizabeth II and, of course, the new king, Charles III. We definitely will talk more about that. That is history unfolding before our eyes. But I wanted to go ahead and get to this since we've been trying to follow this series as closely as we can as the new episodes come out. So let's go ahead and dive into this. As always, the link is in the description to the original content, so you can check them out and see all their other fantastic history content over on Extra Credits.
It's 1193, and Richard the Lionheart, King of England, is missing. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Dowager Queen of England, and the only person holding the web of Angevin alliances together, is frantic. She received word her son's ship wrecked in Italy, and that he'd attempted to travel overland to his brother-in-law's territory in Saxony, but never arrived.
So this shipwreck thing is a pretty common thing, unfortunately, that happens in the Mediterranean. We see, of course, a fictionalized version of that unfold in the movie Kingdom of Heaven, where we see crusaders running into that situation. It was a pretty common thing that would happen. They had this long land route depending on where they were coming from, but if they're coming from England, they're coming from France, they're coming from what we know today as Germany, all the way down here to then go to the Holy Land. A lot of it is tough over land routes, but then a lot of it's tough water routes too. And of course, he runs into the tough overland part.
Meanwhile, her son John is already on the continent, pursuing an alliance with Philip of France, who's only too happy to encourage more Plantagenet infighting. Then the letter arrives.
And just as a reminder, Plantagenet is how we know the dynasty today, beginning with Henry II and then going all the way down. We consider the end of the Plantagenet dynasty to be with the death of Richard III, and then the Tudor dynasty begins. They never called themselves Plantagenets. They would have been known as the Angevin Empire at the time.
It's from Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI informing the court that King Richard is his prisoner. And he will absolutely release the monarch. Provided he receives the sum of 150,000 marks. That's more than double the annual revenue of the English crown.
Double the annual revenue of the English crown to get him back. But it is not very often you get your hands on the King of England. So when you do, you're going to demand a huge ransom. And this is not, it's somewhat unique in that it doesn't happen at this high a level very often, but it's not unique to see people ransomed, noblemen ransomed. It's a great way to make a quick buck if you happen to be on the other side of it.
Eleanor, now 71 years old, gets her quill and parchment and starts fundraising. Today's historic tale is brought to you by the Curiosity Stream Nebula Bundle. More on all of that awesomeness after the episode. The seeds of Richard's capture were sown during the Third Crusade, when at the Siege of Acre, he'd clashed with Leopold of Austria, badly enough that his troops pulled Leopold's battle standard down and threw it from the wall. Infuriated by this, and suspecting that Richard had his relative killed during the crusade, Leopold knew exactly what to do when he heard from informants that Richard was passing through his lands disguised as a returning pilgrim.
So, again, we've talked an awful lot about the difficulty of maintaining alliances from multiple nations with competing interests. And this is just one example of that. The Pope is hoping to unite all of the Christian people in this crusade, this goal to reclaim the Holy Land from the Muslims. But even though they kind of have the same goal, and even though in theory the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing, there's still going to be these competing interests going on here.
Just before Christmas of 1192, he arrested the King of England and shut him up in a castle. When word of this got out, it caused a huge stir. And seeking a more powerful ally, Leopold turned Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who then demanded the exorbitant ransom. 150,000 marks was a lot of money. Eleanor immediately started a letter-writing campaign, petitioning the Pope on Richard's behalf. The letter is, extreme. In it, she says she wishes for death, for blindness, that her brain and blood and marrow dissolve in tears, that she feels her entrails are being ripped out and asks the Pope to pity her now that young Henry and Geoffrey are dust.
That is hardcore stuff, but I get it. I mean, remember, this is a time before we have TV and video chat, right? And the ability to speak face to face like this. And so in order to effectively communicate desperation, it's all in the language that you use. And for her to use these extreme things, it sounds over the top, right? My entrails and, the bleeding of my eyes and blindness and all this stuff, but she's using extreme language to convey an extreme emotion, hoping for an emotional response from the Pope, who's really kind of the one person who can intervene, she thinks, without her having to dish out just ridiculous amounts of money.
2 sons remain in my solace, she wrote, who today survive to punish me, miserable and condemned. King Richard is held in chains. His brother John depletes his kingdom with iron sword and lays waste with fire. In all things the Lord has turned cruel to me and attacked me with the harshness of his hand. The letter worked on the Pope. He excommunicated Leopold of Austria.
Holy cow. I mean, that's what she was after, right? She is using emotion, and she gets an excommunication out of this. This is huge.
It was illegal to detain a crusader, but by then, Richard was in the Holy Roman Emperor's custody, and even the Pope wasn't going to tangle with that. So Eleanor...
All right, so there you have it. He's willing to tackle Austria, but it's a whole different animal when you're dealing with the Holy Roman Empire. The ties between the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope go all the way back to, Charlemagne, and even before Charlemagne, but Charlemagne's really the one who first creates that really strong identification between the Pope as a religious leader and people like the Holy Roman Emperor as a secular leader. And the Holy Roman Empire by this point is powerful. And even though the Pope's got a lot of influence and a lot of power, doesn't have it over everybody.
Set herself to raising the ransom. Not an easy feat, since Richard had stripped the royal treasury and squeezed out new taxes to pay for the crusade. But she whipped up support by casting Richard as a national hero who had boldly taken the cross and won great victories, creating a structure where giving to the cause was an act of loyalty and patriotism. And
here you have some of the foundation of why Richard the Lionheart is remembered as this great crusader and this great warrior, right? Because she's back home spinning this as, look at what an incredible hero he is. And to this day, he's remembered by a lot of people that way. A guy who spent, 6 months of his reign in England.
Nobles competed to offer the biggest contribution. There was a danger, however, that they would be secretly outbid. John and King Philip had offered the Holy Roman Emperor 80,000 marks to keep Richard imprisoned while they tried to put John on the English throne. But that wasn't going so well, though Philip and John had overrun Angevin territory in Normandy. Eleanor and Richard's council had started hardening English defenses as soon as John left for France. So when John's supporters rose up and he crossed the Channel, they made little to no progress. Until one day, in February of 1194, when John got a message from Philip. It read, "Look to yourself. The devil is loose." Eleanor had raised the enormous ransom and managed to get it safely into the emperor's hands.
He's giving him the heads up. You've been pretty much usurping your brother's authority in his absence, but now he's on his way back, so just be ready.
Meaning, King Richard was free and on his way back. John, unable to best his mother, ran back to Normandy. But Richard, probably with Eleanor's counsel, was in a forgiving mood. See, when Richard left for crusade, he'd skipped John over as heir, instead naming his then 2-year-old nephew, Arthur I, Duke of Brittany, as his heir.
Oh yeah, Arthur.
Arthur was Geoffrey's son, born after his brother died, and got the nod, presumably because he was a toddler, and therefore unlikely to seize the crown while Richard was gone.
Yeah. I don't know if we'll get to this part of the story, but if not, we'll talk a little bit about what happens to Arthur.
Yet Richard's capture likely frightened he and Eleanor at the prospect of the English throne going to a 5-year-old, who it should be noted that in the meantime had been kidnapped by Philip and raised in Paris, making him too tied to France. So it turned out, John was the logical choice, and his family would just ignore a little rebelling. Richard, somewhat patronizingly, and again probably with Eleanor's advice, declared that John was but a child, misled by his advisors. I'm sure that John, who was 27 at the time, just loved that. But becoming heir presumptive was worth eating a little crow. And John did it. In fact, he settled down.
Now, let's talk for a second about, you hear these terms all the time, heir presumptive, heir apparent. What's the difference? An heir presumptive can be replaced. An heir apparent, as long as they are alive, they will inherit. So Charles was heir apparent to Queen Elizabeth. There was no circumstance where somebody else could be born and push him out of first place. An heir presumptive can be supplanted. In this case, John's the heir presumptive unless Richard has a child. If Richard has a child, then John's not the heir presumptive anymore. If Richard has a daughter, they become the heir presumptive, but not the heir apparent. If Richard has a son, that's the heir apparent. So hope that makes sense.
Severed his connections to Philip and went about fighting to reclaim the French lands that he'd helped Philip take. Meanwhile, Richard returned to England for a ceremonial redo of his coronation, just to remind everyone who was in charge, and sitting next to him at that ceremony in the Queen's place was not his wife Berengaria, but his mother, Eleanor. As Richard returned to Normandy to reclaim his territories and fortify his castles, Eleanor retired to the Abbey in Aquitaine where she'd buried Henry, and where she'd planned to spend her final years. She was, after all, 72 years old. Having built an empire, she was now leaving it in capable hands, with a steady line of succession. But then in March 1199, she got a message. By the time she got to Richard's bedside, the wound had already gone gangrenous. During the siege of a minor castle, Richard had come to the front line to see an absurd spectacle. A French child was scampering along the wall of the castle, firing at Richard's troops with a crossbow while deflecting incoming arrows with a frying pan. And as Richard the Lionheart watched, amused and totally unarmored, the boy lowered his crossbow and shot the king through the shoulder.
And there's been speculation about the nature of this guy. Some people have said he was a cook, and it might have had something to do with the whole frying pan thing, but we don't know for sure. We do know it ended up happening to him, though.
Richard died in his mother's arms, having never produced an heir, and Eleanor would bury him in her abbey at his father's feet.
So just to kind of expand on that a little bit, Richard didn't die right away. He lived long enough, and he basically gave instructions that no harm come to the guy who shot him. You know, he's a warrior. He understands this was combat, and it was a noble thing to shoot the king, I guess. But when they finally did take the castle, I believe the guy was skinned alive. I know he was horribly tortured and killed.
Leaving the crown of the Angevin Empire to John, the resentful son, always passed over, demeaned, and called deceptive and villainous, now ruled England.
John Lackland, the guy who he was even given a name for the fact he had no land at first, is now the king.
Despite her reservations, Eleanor backed her sole remaining son, ensuring that he, rather than her grandson Arthur of Brittany, would take the throne. But remember years earlier, the Earl of Chester, an old-school Anglo-Norman who still felt tied to the French court, had abducted Arthur to Paris. John's nephew, now 12, had grown up with Philip's son Louis and was unabashedly pro-French.
And what are you going to do if you're French? You've got a claimant to the English throne who is going to take your side and have your interests in mind. You want that kid on the throne as soon as humanly possible. This is a source of rebellion. This is a source of warfare in the making. He's a huge, huge threat if you are John, and it has to be dealt with. And we see this happen all throughout history. When there's someone else with a strong claim to the throne, eventually somebody's got to lose. And by lose, I mean they've probably got to be either held in jail or probably end up dead.
So, John enlisted his mother for one last diplomatic mission. To keep the peace with France, he'd agreed to marry Philip's heir to one of his nieces, the daughter of his sister Eleanor, who his mother had married to the King of Castile. And his mother would also select which niece would be best. The trip was arduous. She had to cross the Pyrenees again, and was briefly held hostage by a French noble, but she accomplished the mission, bringing the girl back. Yet, at the age of 77, and in poor health, Eleanor was slowing down. She had to pass her granddaughter off to others, and retire to her abbey. However, she was dragged out again a year later, when John went to war against Philip. Knowing that young Arthur would strike for Aquitaine, the aged Eleanor traveled to her chief fortress and rallied her forces there, where her 15-year-old grandson besieged them.
Surrender, Grandma. Think about everything that's happened in this woman's life. Her whole life has been marked by fighting between parts of her family, fighting between people that she's connected to, France and England, Aquitaine being right in the middle of it all. Now she's almost 80 years old at a time when people just don't live that long very often. It's an incredible life.
But John swept in and captured Arthur, allowing Eleanor to finally retire to her abbey for real this time and take vows as a nun. And there she rested, living in quiet until she died at the age of 82, buried with her second husband and sons. By one measure, John squandered her hard work. He was a disastrous king who lost much of the French territory his mother had protected for decades via political maneuvering. And after a revolt by English barons, he would be forced to sign the Magna Carta, limiting royal power. But even John couldn't totally squander Eleanor's decades of work. Due to her careful management of succession and political alliances, England held Aquitaine and several other claims in France, remaining a cross-channel empire. This set the agenda of English-French relations for the next 2 centuries and laid the groundwork for the 100 Years' War, which you can watch our series on here. On top of that, Henry and Eleanor's Plantagenet dynasty would rule England for over 3 centuries. But not just England. The fact that she had birthed 3 kings and 2 queens, defended their claims, and strategically married her children into important provinces all across the land gave her the nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. She also inspired a cultural legacy of books, plays, and films that borrowed elements from her life, ranging from Shakespeare's King John to Katharine Hepburn's Oscar-winning performance in The Lion in Winter to the Queen of Thorns in Game of Thrones. And honestly, that really does sum it up. Because when we imagine what political power looked like for women in the Middle Ages, we're often thinking of one woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Absolutely true. I'm going to throw up the link for my reaction to the 100 Years' War series, so you can check that out. But I do want to talk, because we covered a little bit of it, I want to talk about what ends up happening to John's nephew. So a lot of sources about this. I'm just going to Wikipedia because it's easy to get everything in one place, but there's lots of places you can read about this. So Arthur ends up being incarcerated in Rouen Castle in 1203. While his precise fate is unknown, it is generally believed he was killed by John. And I don't just mean ordered his death. A lot of people speculate John, with his own hands, killed his nephew. And it's just one of the things that people use to talk about what a terrible guy John was. So we don't know 100% for sure what ends up happening. But it's almost certain that even if he didn't do it with his own hands, that he had it done on his behalf. He just kind of disappeared, but one account was that Arthur's jailers feared to harm him, so he was murdered by John directly and the body dumped in the Seine River. The Margam Annals provide the following account of Arthur's death. After King John had captured Arthur and kept him alive in prison for some time, at length in the castle of Rouen, after dinner on Thursday before Easter, when he was drunk and possessed by the devil, he slew him with his own hand, tying a heavy stone to the body, cast it into the Seine. It was discovered by a fisherman in his net, and being dragged to the bank and recognized, was taken for secret burial in fear of the tyrant. To the Priory of Bec, which is called St. Mary of the Meadow. There's also other rumors about what might have happened, but there you go. So throw up those links, check out some of the other things there, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.